He didn't know it yet. But the moment he stepped off the trail, his world would change forever. A cough, wet, weak, but unmistakably human, cut through the silence. Rick froze. The Montana forest was supposed to be empty. No people. No threats. No one. And yet, there she was. Tied to a tree. Barely clothed. Green skin bruised and soaked in rain. Her wrists torn where the ropes had bitten deep. Her eyes, not human. Not afraid either. He cut her down. Carried her through the storm. She said nothing, not a single word, until they reached his cabin. Just as he stepped onto the porch, she whispered, "Rick." He stopped cold. Because he had never told her his name. And that's when he realized. She wasn't from Earth. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the trees are watching you. The soft rustle of leaves was barely noticeable, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Rick had been walking along this old trail for hours, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, the smell of wet pine and moss filling the air. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, just another walk through the rugged Montana wilderness, a place where human presence was often little more than a fleeting shadow. But something was different today. Something was off. He paused. There was a sound almost imperceptible at first, a wet cough. It wasn't the sharp, animalistic noise he had expected in the deep woods, but a sound so distinctly human it made the hairs on his neck stand up. It was followed by a soft gasp, like someone struggling to breathe, as if they were fighting against something or someone who had left them for dead. Rick's heart started to race. He instinctively reached for the knife at his side, his hand trembling for a moment. This wasn't just a wanderer lost in the woods. This was something else. He stepped off the trail and into the dense thicket, the rain now falling harder, turning the forest into a blur of gray and green. And then, through the trees, he saw her. Lying there, slumped against the thick trunk of a gnarled tree, her body was barely visible at first, drenched in the downpour. She was naked, save for scraps of tattered fabric clinging weakly to her skin. Her wrists and ankles were raw, as though the rope had been biting into her flesh for days. But it was her skin that took Rick by surprise. Green. Not pale, not sickly, but a vibrant, alien shade of green. Her hair, long and wet, clung to her face, but there was something mesmerizing about her features, inhumanly beautiful, as if carved from another world. The rain slid down her face, making her seem even more ethereal, like a ghost caught in a storm. Rick stepped closer, each movement slow, deliberate, as if he were approaching something he could neither understand nor explain. His knife was still raised in his hand, his mind racing. "You understand me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if the forest itself would steal the words away. Her eyes flickered open, sluggish, struggling to focus. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. She blinked once. No words. No answer. But the way she looked at him, something deep, something ancient, stirred in her gaze. Rick knelt down beside her, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest like the storm above. He reached for the ropes that bound her. With a single, swift motion, he sliced through them, the knife cutting easily through the worn fibers. Her body slumped forward, but he caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her fragile form against him. She was light, too light, like she hadn't eaten in weeks, or maybe much longer. Her breath came in shallow gasps, every intake of air sounding painful, as if each breath was a battle she couldn't quite win. He held her there, the storm pouring down around them. The air smelled thick, wet, and alive with tension. There was no sign of the people who had done this to her. No tracks, no footprints. Whoever had left her here didn't want her found. They had been thorough. "Jesus," Rick muttered under his breath. "What the hell are you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. He adjusted his grip, hoisting her higher against his chest. He turned back towards the ridge. His cabin was a 2-mile hike uphill, But he wasn't sure if he could make it with a storm so fierce. Yet, there was no other choice. She had to make it there. She had to survive. Nickmore woke slowly, her eyes fluttering open, blinking against the soft light of the cabin. The air was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke, not the damp, bitter cold of the forest. Rick was sitting across the room, a distant figure in the shadows, watching her carefully. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours. She shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the blanket wrapped around her, the rough fabric scratching her skin. The injuries on her body, the bruises, the cuts, they still ached, but the pain was more manageable now. She pushed herself up, her hands trembling slightly. Rick didn't say anything. He just sat there, waiting. "You're awake," he said, his voice low, a hint of something like relief in it. Nickmore nodded, her throat dry. She swallowed hard. "I didn't expect to wake up." Rick's eyes narrowed, studying her closely. "You should have died out there," he said bluntly, the weight of his words lingering in the air. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted her gaze to the window, as if searching for something outside. She could feel the weight of his stare, but she didn't want to meet it. Not yet. Rick stood up, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He walked over to the stove and picked up a tin can of soup, heating it on the flames. He didn't ask her if she was hungry. He just did it, like he had done it 100 times before. The silence between them stretched out, the only sound the crackling fire and the steady, rhythmic movements of Rick. He brought her the soup, placing it in front of her without a word. She stared at it for a long moment before lifting the spoon to her lips. The warmth of the broth seemed to soothe her, though she didn't know if it was the food or the feeling of being alive that was doing it. "You don't talk much," she said finally, her voice rough and dry from the journey, the storm, and the ordeal she had endured. Rick shrugged, sitting back down across from her. Not much to say. There was something in his eyes, something distant, like he was hiding a part of himself. But there was no use prying. She had her own demons to deal with. Her eyes lowered to the soup, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She had to remember who she was. She had to remember what she came here for. But the fog of what had happened, the betrayal, the lies, it was all too much. "Why did you save me?" Nickmore asked, her voice soft, almost to herself. Rick didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He simply looked at her, his face hard as stone. "I didn't think it was right, leaving you to die out there." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze finally meeting his. "You don't even know what I am." "No," he replied. "But I know what someone tied to a tree and left to die looks like. And that's enough." There was a long silence between them. Nickmore's fingers curled around the edge of the bowl, her mind racing through the confusion, the memories. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be alive. She had been exiled, a tool discarded by the people who once relied on her. "I didn't mean for you to know my name," she said quietly. Rick raised an eyebrow. "You have a name. I'll call you whatever you want." "I don't think you understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't just find me. You found a ghost." Rick didn't flinch. "I don't care what you think you are. You're here now." Nickmore's lips curled into a small, almost sad smile. "You're right," she said, her voice steadying. "I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and full of unspoken meaning. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, there was a quiet stillness, a shared understanding between two people who had both been broken in different ways. Rick sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes studying her once more. "You sure you're not going to try to kill me in my sleep?" Nickmore's smile softened, though there was something darker behind her eyes. "You'd be the first to know." The cabin felt even quieter now, as if the storm outside had become a part of the silence between them. It was a fragile peace, built on shared survival rather than trust. But it was all they had. And for now, it would have to be enough. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled through the trees, shaking the cabin's walls like a restless ghost. Rick sat in his chair by the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. He kept his eyes on Nickmore, watching her closely. The tension in the air between them was palpable, but neither of them spoke. Nickmore sat on the couch, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the fire. She seemed lost in thought, her mind far away, somewhere Rick couldn't follow. Her fingers toyed with the hem of the blanket, restless and uneasy. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but cutting through the stillness. "You don't trust me, do you?" Rick's gaze shifted to her, his jaw tight. "I don't trust anyone." She didn't look up at him, but he could see her lips press into a thin line, as though she were waiting something. "I didn't ask for your trust." Rick leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "No, but you're asking for something else. You're asking me to let you stay. To keep you safe. And for that, I need to know who you really are." Nickmore turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in a while. There was something unreadable in her eyes, a storm of emotions that Rick couldn't quite decipher. "I told you what I was. I'm not from here. I'm not like you." He nodded, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. "Yeah, I know that. But you're not telling me everything. You're hiding something. And you're not going to survive here if I don't know what it is." She hesitated, eyes flickering away. Then, with a sigh, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm running from my past. From the people who decided I was expendable." Rick didn't speak for a moment. He could feel the weight of her words, the truth hanging between them like a thick fog. "Expendable," he repeated. Nickmore's eyes glinted with something sharp, something dangerous. "I was a councilwoman on my world. The Green Blade. I fought for the people who had no voice, exposed corruption, slavery, and war crimes. But the people in power, they didn't like that. They framed me for a murder I didn't commit. Stripped me of everything. My title. My name. My life. They sent me here, to die." Rick's heart skipped a beat. The weight of her story pressed on him, but he couldn't let it show. "And they think you're dead?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah." She exhaled sharply. "They thought they could bury me. But I'm not dead yet." Rick's gaze hardened. He had his own demons, his own battles that he didn't talk about. But he understood what it was like to be left for dead. To be discarded like nothing. "So now what?" he asked, his voice steady but with a trace of empathy he hadn't intended. "You just wait for someone to come find you? Or you're planning on going back to your people?" Nickmore's lips twitched, her eyes glinting with a mix of anger and something else, something more complicated. "Going back? I have no place to go. My people? They betrayed me. Exiled me. I'll never go back. But that doesn't mean I'm done." Rick sat back in his chair, absorbing her words. "So what now?" he asked, leaning forward again, his voice more demanding this time. "What's your plan? You can't just hide here forever." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't come here to hide. I came here to survive. And if I have to fight to do that, I will." Rick felt a flicker of something in his chest, something that wasn't just caution, but something closer to respect. He didn't know if he could trust her, not yet, but he could see that Nickmore wasn't someone who was going to back down. And that kind of resolve? It wasn't something you saw every day. "Then we fight," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But we do it on my terms. We don't take any risks. We stay off the radar. No more running." Nickmore's lips curled into a small, almost bitter smile. "Your terms, huh?" "Yeah," Rick said, his gaze never leaving hers. "You might not be from this world, but you're in my world now. And in my world, We don't let anyone get the drop on us. We keep our heads down, we keep moving, and we don't take chances we can't afford. For the first time, Nickmore's posture softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. All right, Rick. Your world. For now. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Rick didn't know what the future held, or what kind of storm they were about to face, but one thing was certain, Nickmore wasn't going anywhere. And neither was he. She glanced up at him, her voice quieter now. Thanks. For saving me. Rick didn't say anything at first. Instead, he stood up, walking to the window and peering out into the stormy night. I didn't save you, he muttered, turning back to her with a hard look in his eyes. I just didn't let you die. There's a difference. Nickmore watched him, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. Yeah, she whispered. I guess there is. And for the first time since they had met, something like understanding passed between them. A silent agreement, forged not in words, but in the shared weight of their circumstances. Both of them were survivors. And that was enough for now. Nickmore sat by the fire, her gaze flicking between the dancing flames and Rick, who was busy rummaging through the cabin, seemingly lost in thought. The air in the room was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that clung to you long after a conversation had ended. She knew Rick was still trying to piece her story together, still unsure whether to believe every word she said. It wasn't as if she expected him to trust her right away. After all, she was a stranger to him, an alien, a fugitive from a world he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But that didn't change the fact that she was here now, in this strange, isolated place, and somehow, against all odds, they had found a way to survive together. Rick broke the silence, his voice low but deliberate. So, what happened next? After they exiled you, how did you end up here? Nickmore's eyes darkened, the flicker of the fire reflecting in her pupils like an echo of something far more dangerous. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. I was thrown out with nothing, she said, her tone steady but hard. No ship, no resources, no chance. Just a crashpot and a one-way ticket to a planet that didn't even know I existed. She paused, the weight of the memory pressing down on her chest. But I survived. I always survive. Rick didn't speak right away. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to figure out if she was telling the truth or if it was all just another elaborate lie. Finally, he let out a breath, walking over to the stove and grabbing the last of the soup. And after you crash-landed here, he asked, his voice softening slightly. What then? Nickmore's lips tightened as she took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside her mind. I had to find my bearings, figure out where I was. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the ones who might have wanted to help. Earth, it's not like I expected. But I've learned to adapt. To survive. She looked up at him, her gaze sharp, her voice dropping lower, like she was confiding in someone who might actually understand. I had to become someone else to stay alive. Someone they couldn't track, couldn't predict. I lost my identity, Rick. I lost everything except my will to fight. Rick paused, his back still turned toward her as he stirred the soup. So, you fought. And now what? What's the plan now that you're here? Nickmore's eyes glinted in the firelight. The plan? To survive. To take back what was taken from me. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. But not just for me. For the people I left behind. For the ones who couldn't fight back. They were all crushed under the weight of the system I used to serve. Rick didn't say anything, just stood there, his back still to her as he listened. It was clear that something inside him had shifted, a quiet understanding that this woman wasn't just a stranger who had stumbled into his life. She was someone who had fought a war of her own, a war he could barely begin to fathom. Nickmore continued, her voice a little quieter now, tinged with something vulnerable. I exposed corruption. I exposed the truth, even when it meant putting my life on the line. And for that, they branded me a traitor. A criminal. Rick finally turned around, setting the soup down on the table in front of her. He studied her with an intensity she hadn't expected. You're not a criminal, he said simply, his voice steady. You're a survivor. A fighter. Nickmore smiled faintly, though there was something bittersweet in her expression. Fighting doesn't always make you a hero, she murmured. Sometimes it just makes you a target. Rick raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to the window, as if he could sense the storm still brewing outside, both in the world and in their conversation. So, what now? He asked. What do you want from me? For a moment, Nickmore didn't respond. She simply stared into the fire, her mind racing through the tangled web of her past and present. She had come here to escape, to disappear, to forget. But the truth had a way of catching up with her, no matter how far she ran. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I want you to help me. Not because I think you owe me anything, but because you're the only one who can. Rick didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just stared at her, his gaze piercing through the tension in the room. Help you how? Nickmore stood, moving toward the window and peering outside at the darkening forest. I need to know what's happening out there. I need to find out who's still loyal to the old council and who's trying to rebuild. Earth was supposed to be my exile. But I can't stay here forever. I need to know if there's a way back. Rick followed her gaze, his hand resting on the knife at his side, his mind turning over the possibilities. And if there's no way back, he asked, his voice low. Nickmore turned to face him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and something more dangerous. Then we burn it all down. We start again. From the ashes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire, and outside, the storm continued its endless march through the night. Nickmore's gaze never left Rick's, as if she were silently daring him to disagree, to turn her down. But he didn't. He simply nodded, once, a quiet understanding settling between them. All right, Rick said, his voice calm but firm. We do it your way. But no more running. No more secrets. Nickmore's smile was small, but it carried a weight that Rick knew all too well. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I never planned on running, she replied, her voice steady. And there are no more secrets. Just the truth. And whatever comes next. Rick nodded again, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the fire, the silence falling between them once more. They were both in this now. And there was no going back. The storm outside had faded into a quiet drizzle, but inside, the cabin still felt like a battleground of unspoken words and unresolved tension. Nickmore sat at the small wooden table, her fingers drumming absently against the surface. Rick stood by the fire, adding logs to the dwindling flame, his thoughts far away. The silence between them felt heavy. There was no denying the tension, the pull between the past she was running from and the future she was trying to rebuild. But Nickmore couldn't afford to dwell on either. Not now. She needed answers. You said you'd help me, she broke the silence, her voice low, though it carried a quiet command. But helping me means stepping into a war that's been brewing for a long time. Are you prepared for that? Rick glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression unreadable. I've been in wars before. They just look different, he said, his voice steady, but there was something darker behind it. What makes this one any different? Nickmore's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. This war is about survival. Not just mine, but everyone's. It's about the people who've been crushed under the weight of corruption. The ones who've had their futures stolen by people like Arvik. And if you want to help me, you have to be ready to fight for them too. Rick didn't move for a moment, his gaze distant, but Nickmore could see the shift in him. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way he gripped the edge of the chair like he was holding onto something more than just the wood. "Fight for them," he repeated, as though testing the words on his tongue. "I'm not some soldier. I don't fight for causes I don't believe in." Nickmore stood, her eyes hardening. "You're right. You're not. But you will fight for survival. For the truth. For the people who deserve a future. If you think you can just hide here forever, you're wrong. They'll find you eventually. They'll find me. And when they do, we'll be ready." Rick's hand slowly released the chair, and for a second, his gaze softened. "So we go on the offensive, then?" Nickmore nodded. "We expose them. We tear down the system from the inside out." There was a long pause, the fire crackling between them, and then Rick finally spoke, his voice quieter this time. "All right. We do it your way. But don't think for a second I'm doing this for anyone but myself. And you." Nickmore studied him for a moment, her eyes searching for something, some sign that she could trust him. But all she saw was resolve. And that was enough. "Good," she said, her voice firm. "Then let's get to work." The night had fallen completely, leaving the cabin in near darkness except for the soft glow of the fire. Rick moved quietly, gathering what little gear he had. A shotgun. A couple of knives. A pack of supplies that would last a few days, if they were careful. Nickmore stood by the window, her fingers lightly touching the old, cracked glass. Her mind was miles away, running through plans, strategies, and the network of allies she hoped still existed in the shadows. The people who would listen to her call. The ones who still remembered the truth. But she knew this wasn't going to be easy. Exposing Arvak and the Council would take more than just words. It would take proof. It would take fire. "You ready?" Rick asked, his voice low as he approached her. Nickmore nodded without turning. "We'll leave at dawn. I'll need to access a relay station near the capital. It's the last unmonitored link to my world." Rick raised an eyebrow. "The capital? You're planning to go right into the heart of enemy territory." "Exactly," she said, her voice cold, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're either in this or you're not, Rick." He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her with an intensity that was almost unnerving. "You know, you've got a way of making even the craziest ideas sound like a good plan," he muttered, securing his knife at his side. Nickmore turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need your approval. I just need you to follow my lead." Rick chuckled, the sound low and dry. "You've got my attention. For now." She stepped away from the window, moving toward the door. "Let's get out of here before they realize we're still breathing." They crossed the threshold together, stepping out into the cold night. The forest around them was quiet, the only sound their footsteps on the wet ground as they made their way toward the edge of the ridge. Nickmore led the way, her mind sharp, focused. She could feel the weight of everything pressing on her, but she didn't let it show. She had been through worse. She had survived worse. And now, it was time to take back what had been stolen from her. Rick walked silently behind her, his hand resting lightly on the shotgun. The night was still, the air thick with anticipation. They didn't speak. There was no need. They both knew what was coming. The wind shifted, and the faint hum of something in the distance reached their ears. Nickmore's eyes narrowed. "They're close," she said, barely more than a whisper. Rick gripped his shotgun tighter. "How close?" "Too close." They quickened their pace, moving through the forest with the practiced ease of people who had been on the run for too long. But this time, it wasn't about escape. It was about making a stand. And it was only the beginning. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting only the faintest glow on the rugged terrain below. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night chirping insects, the rustling of leaves, the creaking of branches swaying in the wind. But there was something unsettling about the quiet tonight. The forest felt too still, as though it were holding its breath. Rick and Nickmore moved with practiced silence, keeping low to the ground as they neared the clearing. The old relay station loomed ahead, an abandoned outpost from a time when communication had been easier, when the outside world still cared about the territory. Now, it was little more than a crumbling relic of a forgotten war. Nickmore stopped just at the edge of the clearing, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The relay station was silent, the doors closed tight, but she knew that wasn't enough to keep them safe. They were in enemy territory now. Rick stepped up beside her, his eyes narrowing as he checked the surroundings. "You sure this is the place?" he asked quietly, his hand resting on his shotgun. Nickmore nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is the last unmonitored relay to my world. It's the only way I can get the information we need." She glanced at him, her voice low but firm. "If we're going to make this work, we need to move fast. We don't know how much time we have before they send reinforcements." Rick's gaze flickered to the shadows beyond the station, his instincts kicking in. "Reinforcements? How many?" Nickmore didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure how many soldiers were out there, but she didn't need to. She could feel it, an undercurrent of danger that had been following them since they left the cabin. "Not sure," she finally said, her eyes cold and calculating. "But they're not just here to keep the relay secure. They're here to find me. And once they do, they won't hesitate." Rick exhaled sharply, adjusting the shotgun on his back. "Then we make sure they don't find you?" Without another word, Nickmore darted into the clearing, moving swiftly but with the quiet precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Rick followed, keeping his distance, his eyes scanning every corner of the clearing, every shadow in the trees. They reached the base of the relay station, the metal walls rusted and weather-worn, but still standing strong. Nickmore knelt by the access panel, pulling out a small device from her jacket, a hacking tool she had fashioned herself. The tiny lights on the device blinked red, then green as she worked quickly, bypassing the station's old security protocols. Rick stood guard, his senses on high alert. The silence around him felt almost suffocating now, the air thick with tension. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the adrenaline starting to rise. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a minute," Nickmore replied, her fingers flying over the device. "We're almost there." Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stood on end. He heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the trees. The hairs on his arms prickled. They weren't alone. "Shit," Rick muttered, grabbing Nickmore's arm. "We've got company." Nickmore's eyes flashed, and without another word, she pressed herself into the shadows beside the station. Rick followed her lead, his movements swift and silent, like a predator in the dark. They crouched low, waiting, watching. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Rick's grip tightened on his weapon. He could see figures moving through the trees too, maybe 3 dressed in the black armor of the Viral Enforcement Division. The same soldiers who had hunted her, the same ones who had sworn to wipe her from existence. Rick's pulse quickened as the soldiers moved closer. He felt the heat of Nickmore's presence beside him, her breath steady, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, her voice like ice. "If they find us now, we're dead." Rick nodded, though his instincts were screaming at him to do something, anything to protect her. But he held back. He had learned long ago that reacting impulsively would only get them both killed. The soldiers passed by, unaware of their presence. Nickmore's fingers clenched around the device in her hand, her jaw set in a hard line. She waited for the perfect moment, watching as the soldiers disappeared into the darkness. "Now," she muttered. In one fluid motion, she jumped to her feet, activating the device. The relay station's door slid open with a faint hiss, the inside of the building now bathed in a cold blue light. Nickmore moved inside, Rick closed behind her. But just as they crossed the threshold, a voice echoed from the forest. "Stop right there." Rick spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The soldiers had spotted them. There was no time to think, only to act. Nickmore's eyes met his for a split second. "Go," she hissed. Without a word, Rick fired a shot into the air, a warning. The soldiers flinched, taking cover behind the trees. But Nickmore was already moving, her body a blur as she sprinted toward the interior of the relay station. She reached the control panel, her hands working quickly to access the encrypted files. Rick held his ground, eyes darting between the trees and the open door behind him. He could feel the tension building, the pressure mounting. The soldiers weren't just after Nickmore anymore, they were after both of them. Nickmore's voice came from inside, sharp and urgent. "I've got it. We're going to need to move fast." But just as she spoke, the sound of a helicopter echoed in the distance, its blades cutting through the air with a deafening roar. Rick's heart sank. The game had changed. They were no longer just hiding, they were being hunted. Nickmore turned to him, her expression unreadable. "There's no going back now." Rick's grip tightened on his shotgun. "Then let's make sure they regret coming after us." They both turned toward the door, ready for whatever came next. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm they were about to face. The hum of the helicopter grew louder as it circled overhead, its spotlight cutting through the night like a relentless predator. The once quiet clearing now felt like the center of a storm, both the one brewing in the sky and the one inside the walls of the relay station. Nickmore was still at the control panel, her fingers moving frantically over the keys, her mind racing through a million possibilities. The encrypted files she had accessed flashed across the screen, raw data, hidden transmissions, classified information, everything she needed to expose the Council's corruption. But the soldiers outside weren't just waiting. They were closing in. Rick stood by the door, his shotgun gripped tightly in his hands, his eyes darting between the windows, watching for any sign of movement. The wind outside had picked up, the storm now more of a violent assault than a drizzle. He could feel the pressure mounting. Their window of escape was closing rapidly. "How long?" he called over to Nickmore, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Nickmore didn't look up from the screen, but her voice was sharp. "I'm almost there. Just a few more seconds." Rick's gaze snapped back to the door. He could hear the soldiers, now 3 of them, maybe more, moving quickly toward the station. The sound of boots on wet ground, the unmistakable rustle of armor against foliage. They were getting too close. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We're running out of time." Nickmore didn't respond. Instead, her hand hovered over the console, the tip of her finger almost touching the final key. Her breath was shallow, her mind focused on one thing, getting this information out before they were caught. Then, without warning, the door behind Rick slammed open. 2 soldiers burst in, guns raised. "Move," one of them shouted. Rick didn't hesitate. He spun around, his shotgun coming up in one smooth motion. The blast was deafening, sending the soldier stumbling back, his weapon flying from his hand. The other soldier ducked behind the door frame, firing blindly, but Rick was already on the move. Nickmore's head snapped up at the sound of the gunfire. She had no time to think. She reached down, pulling a small, sleek device from her belt, a detonator. She didn't need to look at it. She pressed the button, and the relay station's doors locked shut with a loud metallic clang. "We need to go now," Nickmore shouted. Rick shot one last glance at the soldier still recovering from the blast, then dashed toward Nickmore. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back exit of the station. The helicopter's spotlight was now visible through the crack in the door, sweeping over the ground, searching for them. They burst out into the night, the cold rain slapping against their faces. The dark, dense forest surrounded them, but they had no illusions, time was running out. As they ran, Rick glanced back at the relay station. The soldiers were already regrouping, moving toward their position, ready to give chase. The helicopter was still circling above, its blade slicing through the air like a vulture waiting to swoop down. "We need cover," Rick panted, pulling Nickmore along. Head for the ridge. Nickmore nodded, her eyes scanning the trees ahead. They were heading toward higher ground, hoping the terrain would give them a better chance of escaping. But the helicopter was closing in fast. The wind and rain were making it difficult to hear, but she could feel the hum of the rotor blades above them. And then, without warning, the sound of a voice broke through the chaos. "Stop right there." Nickmore's heart skipped a beat as she froze. The soldier's voice was unmistakable, and from the sound of it, they were trapped. Rick's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, but Nickmore grabbed his arm, stopping him. She turned to face him, her eyes steely with resolve. "We don't fight them here," she whispered. "We keep moving." They continued to run, faster now, with the soldiers hot on their heels. They had no choice but to push forward, deeper into the forest. Rick's breath came in ragged gasps, but he kept his pace, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering over them, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms in the night. The only sound now was the pounding of their footsteps and a distant, ominous whir of the helicopter above. Rick and Nickmore reached the ridge just as the first blast of gunfire rang out behind them. The soldiers had caught up. Nickmore didn't flinch. She spun around, pulling a small, metallic device from her jacket. "Stay low," she shouted to Rick. Before he could react, she threw the device into the air. It exploded with a sharp crack, sending a blinding flash of light and sound through the forest. The soldiers stopped in their tracks, disoriented by the explosion. The helicopter's spotlight flickered, momentarily blinded by the flash. Rick didn't waste a second. He grabbed Nickmore by the arm, pulling her toward the edge of the ridge. The steep drop below them was enough to send them tumbling into the dense underbrush, but it was their only chance. The helicopter circled above, its searchlight scanning the area. The soldiers shouted, trying to regroup, but the noise from the explosion had thrown them off. Rick and Nickmore scrambled down the slope, their hands scraping against rocks and tree roots. They didn't stop, didn't look back, their only focus on getting out of sight. As they reached the bottom of the ridge, Nickmore pulled Rick behind a large boulder, her chest heaving with exertion. The rain had started to let up, but the cold was biting, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and metal. "How much further?" Rick asked, his voice rough. Nickmore looked around, her sharp eyes scanning the landscape. "Just a little farther," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We've got a safe house nearby. We just need to get to it before they realize what we've done." Rick nodded, wiping the rain from his eyes. "Then let's move." They didn't hesitate. The soldiers were still searching the ridge above them, but they wouldn't stay distracted for long. Nickmore grabbed Rick's arm again, pulling him toward the trees. The final move was imminent, and with it, the stakes were higher than ever. It was no longer just about survival. It was about taking back what had been stolen, and they were both ready to make their stand. The forest seemed to close in around them, but for the first time, they weren't running. They were fighting, and they were going to make sure they came out on top. She came to Earth as a prisoner, beaten, betrayed, and left for dead. But she didn't die. She found a man who didn't ask questions. Who saw a stranger tied to a tree and chose to save her anyway. And from that single moment everything changed. She remembered who she was. She remembered what they took. And she decided to take it back. With fire. With truth. And with a war that started with just two people. But shook the walls of an empire. Her name was Nickmore. His was Rick. And together they reminded the galaxy what happens when you push the wrong ones too far. But this was only the beginning. Because somewhere out there, the ones who betrayed her are still watching. Still afraid. And they should be. Because she's not done. Not yet. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe, stay close, and get ready. The galaxy has no idea what's coming.